You see, sometimes when we face with the silence of God, it's not a sign that something's gone wrong. It's actually a sign that something is going to go right. When my son was much younger, every day I'd come home from work about tea time, and straight away he'd want to drag me into the back garden because every night I came home and we would play football in the garden as long as the weather was suitable every single day. And as a father, often playing football, I made him sad. I made him upset and that was deliberate, that I wouldn't always let him win. And each time he would lose in the early days, he'd get upset and he'd kind of try and storm up. And I'd always pull him back. And I'd say every time, I'd give him this lesson. I'd say every time we play, when we finish, we always go to the middle of the pitch, our back garden. We shake hands and we say, "Good game." And I would teach him, we do that every time. And sometimes I would let him win, and sometimes I wouldn't let him win. And that would be very deliberate. Not because I was a unloving father, but because I was a loving father. And sometimes he needed to lose. I didn't want him just to always win, because why would I not want him to let him win every single time? Because I knew that as he grew up, if in the family home that I always let him to win, that he wouldn't learn to lose. He wouldn't learn to take failure. And actually, once he got over the upset and we shook hands and we'd say, "Good game," what would rise up in him would be a determination the next day to beat his dad. And in a sense, that sense of failure, that he wasn't yet good enough to beat his dad, would stir up a desire to be better and to be stronger. And while I was at work, he would be at home. He'd come home from school, he'd go in the back garden and he'd practice his skills for an hour or two before I come home, because he was inspired to try and beat me, to try and be better. Sometimes the silence from God is an invitation for us to get better. It's an invitation for us to grow. Sometimes for people who are grown plants, sometimes you might not always water them 100%. Sometimes it's good for plants to have that desire to kind of seek out the moisture in the soil. That if they go through seasons when there's not so much moisture around, it actually makes their roots stronger as they seek out where the nutrients are. And sometimes that can be what happens with us, that we go through a dry season because God wants us to strengthen their roots. In fact, I think that often what happens to people who come to faith is God is very present. And if you become a new Christian, everything is very easy at the beginning. You might read the Bible and it's so excited to read the Bible and the meaning jumps off the page. You maybe come into church and where we have worship all together and God just feels so present. Every song just kind of inspires you. And it's great having new Christians around because they just love everything about church and faith and God. But it's important for new Christians to be taught that actually life's not always like that. And actually sometimes I think God deliberately leads us into a silence when worship can be dry, when the Bible struggles to make much sense, when our time of praying with God just seems to lack the energy that it used to have. And that's not a sign that something's gone wrong. It's actually an invitation from God to seek deeper, to strengthen our roots. Because just like as a child, if everything's always easy, they retain a kind of immaturity. Their character doesn't get a chance to develop. It's the same for us on our faith journey. If everything's always easy, it doesn't give us a chance to grow. And in fact, we become very selfish. And sometimes what God wants to do is to wean us off the feelings of faith to find the source of faith. Sometimes he wants to wean us off the good feelings in order we can seek after the one behind the feelings. Because if it's always good and it's always simple, there can be kind of an immaturity around that. And people sometimes have kind of mapped the stages of faith. And I don't think it's quite that simple of how do you get from immaturity to maturity and you go through 4 different phases. But what I think is true is for many people, God will bring them to the dark night of the soul. They'll bring them to a dry season. That doesn't mean in our story that Jesus caused the woman daughter to be severely tormented. I don't think God sent evil into her daughter's life in order to give some sort of faith lesson to her. But I think at that moment, the reason that Jesus was silent, the reason that he never said a word to her, is actually an invitation an invitation for her to kind of grow into the silence, to kind of respond. And oh, how she did respond.